The Hayes residence stood at the edge of Willow Creek, a once vibrant two-story home that had seen decades of laughter, Sunday dinners, and the bustling footsteps of children racing through its halls. Now the house seemed to sag under the weight of silence. The once pristine garden Eleanor Hayes had proudly tended was overgrown, daisies bending low as if in mourning. Curtains were drawn most days, and only the faint glow of a lamp in the front room told the neighbors that Eleanor was still inside. Eleanor herself was a woman both graceful and weary. At 78, her frame had thinned, but her eyes, blue and piercing, still carried the spark of the proud matriarch she once was. She had raised 3 children on equal measures of discipline and love. Michael, the eldest, had inherited her sharp wit but lacked her compassion. Jessica, her only daughter, had Eleanor's elegance but little of her humility. David, the youngest, had once been her closest companion, but his reckless choices had driven a wedge between them. Now, those children lived far from Willow Creek, chasing careers and reputations that left little room for their mother. Phone calls came less and less frequently, reduced to brief holiday check-ins or hurried conversations about business and family obligations. Sometimes, weeks stretched into months without a single word. Eleanor told herself not to mind, but in the quiet hours of the night she would sit in her armchair, hands folded, listening to the hollow tick of the grandfather clock, wondering when her family had started treating her like a relic rather than the woman who had built their foundation. Her granddaughter Lily was her only regular visitor. At first, Lily came often, bringing college assignments to work on at the kitchen table, filling the house with youthful chatter. But as semesters rolled by, visits grew fewer. When Lily did come, she was often distracted, scrolling her phone or rushing to leave. Eleanor never scolded her for it. Youth had its distractions, but a quiet ache settled deeper in her chest with each passing visit. The townspeople of Willow Creek, however, had not forgotten her. The mailman lingered a little longer on her porch, sharing news about his children. The local grocer often slipped an extra loaf of bread into her bag. Her neighbor, Mrs. Clark, would stop by with warm pies, insisting Eleanor taste them while they were fresh. These small gestures stitched together the frayed edges of her solitude, reminding her that kindness was still alive, even if not from the family she once devoted her life to. As Eleanor sat in her armchair one evening, the autumn wind rattling the windows, she realized her story wasn't over. She might be forgotten by her children, but she would not fade quietly. With steady hands, she began to draft letters and notes, a plan forming that would one day shake her children, her town, and perhaps even herself. This was not the end of Eleanor Hayes. It was the beginning of her final act. On the surface, the Hayes siblings seemed like the embodiment of success, the pride of Willow Creek. Their names were often mentioned in church circles, local newspapers, and whispered conversations at the town diner. Yet beneath the polished veneers of their lives lay cracks so deep that only Eleanor, in her quiet wisdom, had seen them for what they truly were: dangerous fissures waiting to split wide open. Michael Hayes, the eldest, wore expensive suits and carried himself with the swagger of a man who had conquered the business world. To the community, he was a self-made success story, a son of Willow Creek who had climbed the ladder and now sat at the top of his own company. But Eleanor knew better. She had noticed the evasive way he spoke when she asked simple questions about his finances. His empire wasn't built on stability but on shifting sands, shell companies, forged signatures, and borrowed money. Michael lived in fear of being exposed, yet he comforted himself with the belief that no one in Willow Creek could possibly uncover the truth. Jessica Hayes, elegant and refined, had always been the daughter people envied. She married Charles Whitman, a lawyer from an influential family, and together they projected the image of a perfect couple. They hosted lavish dinner parties, donated to charities, and took annual trips abroad, photos of which splashed across their social media feeds. But behind the smiles, Jessica carried a secret she had hidden even from her mother. Her marriage was a brittle facade. For nearly 2 years, she had been entangled in a passionate affair with a man who lived just a few streets away in Willow Creek. The secrecy thrilled her, but it also kept her awake at night, fearing discovery. David Hayes, the youngest, had once been Eleanor's greatest joy. He was the child who lingered in the kitchen to help her bake pies, who sat by her bedside when she was sick, who swore he'd always protect her. But as an adult, his reckless habits consumed him. Gambling had become his weakness, First small bets with friends, then dangerous debts with people who didn't forgive easily. Years ago, Eleanor had nearly lost her home when David forged her signature to cover what he owed. Though she saved him from ruin, their relationship never fully recovered. David lived in a cycle of promises and relapses, still chasing fortune at the card table. Each sibling believed their secrets were safe, locked behind walls of pride and distance. But Eleanor, even in her solitude, had a way of seeing through masks. She carried their truths in silence, never confronting them directly, though each revelation had carved another wound in her heart. She had hoped, for years, that time would guide them back to her, to honesty, to family. Instead, their secrets only grew heavier, poisoning whatever remained of their bond. What none of them knew was that Eleanor had begun quietly documenting everything: dates, names, debts, even confessions slipped in drunken phone calls. She was no fool. She understood that the day would come when her silence would no longer serve them, or her. And when that day arrived, the secrets they thought were buried would rise like ghosts, ready to destroy the legacy they so carefully pretended to protect. The autumn days in Willow Creek had grown shorter, and the crisp evening air carried with it the scent of falling leaves and wood smoke. Eleanor Hayes sat by her window, a knitted shawl draped across her shoulders, watching the orange and gold foliage drift lazily to the ground. The world outside seemed alive and vibrant, but within her house, silence pressed against the walls like an uninvited guest. At 78, Eleanor had grown accustomed to the rhythm of solitude. She moved with deliberate care, pouring her tea in the mornings, reading the newspaper, though much of it no longer concerned her, and tending to her small patch of flowers that had managed to survive the first frosts. Yet, in the stillness of those final days, she began to sense what her body already knew. Her time was nearing its end. It wasn't sudden, nor was it cruel. Eleanor slipped into the awareness gently, like noticing the dusk creeping across a room. There were no dramatic gasps, no hospital machines, just a quiet certainty that her life was winding down. She found peace in this knowledge. For years, she had carried the ache of abandonment, the disappointment of children who had forgotten the very hands that once guided them. Now she realized she had no need to cling to that pain. She was ready to let go, though not before setting her affairs in a way that would speak long after her voice fell silent. Her children, of course, were oblivious. Michael was in New York, closing yet another questionable deal. Jessica was planning a holiday trip with her husband, posting smiling pictures online. David, somewhere between bars and borrowed money, hadn't called in months. None of them imagined their mother's heart was slowing, that each beat carried her closer to her final breath. It was the neighbor, Mrs. Clark, who found her. On a gray October morning, she knocked with a basket of muffins, and, when Eleanor didn't answer, let herself in through the unlocked door. There she was, sitting peacefully, in her favorite armchair, her shawl still wrapped around her, the faintest smile etched on her lips as if she had been dreaming of something better. The news traveled quickly through Willow Creek. By sundown, the whole town knew. Eleanor Hayes, the woman who had once been the lifeblood of her family, had passed quietly in her sleep. The church bells tolled in her honor, and neighbors gathered on porches, speaking her name with reverence. Far away, her children received the news with varying shades of shock and inconvenience. Michael cursed the timing. He had a meeting scheduled. Jessica cried, but her tears felt rehearsed. David, the most shaken, drowned his guilt in whiskey. Each of them, however, carried the same assumption. Their mother's passing meant an inheritance. A house, savings, maybe more. None of them suspected that Eleanor had left behind more than just money. She had left behind the truth, sealed in a message that would soon unravel everything they thought they knew. The Hayes siblings returned to Willow Creek not out of devotion, but out of expectation. Michael arrived first, stepping out of a sleek black sedan, his phone glued to his ear as though business couldn't possibly pause for grief. Jessica followed a day later, immaculately dressed in a black designer suit that seemed better suited for a high-profile gala than a funeral. David was last, stumbling into town with weary eyes, the faint smell of liquor trailing him like a shadow. None of them had spent much time in Willow Creek since leaving home, but the moment Eleanor's death was announced, each calculated what they believed awaited them. Eleanor had lived a modest but steady life. There was the family house, some land, and, surely, savings tucked away. To them, The funeral was simply a necessary step before the will could be read and the inheritance divided. The funeral itself was intimate, attended mostly by neighbors, church members, and townspeople who remembered Eleanor not just as a mother, but as a woman who had touched lives with small acts of kindness. The Hayes children stood stiffly at the front pew, strangers in their own hometown, their grief tempered by impatience. When the pastor concluded the service, whispers began to spread about the unusual request Eleanor had left behind. There would be no private will reading at a lawyer's office. Instead, her wishes were to be shared with the entire community. 2 days later, the townspeople gathered in the church hall, a building Eleanor had once helped fundraise to restore. Wooden pews creaked under the weight of families, curious onlookers, and even some who had traveled from neighboring towns just to witness what was being described as Eleanor's last surprise. The air buzzed with speculation. Why had she chosen such a public setting? What could she possibly have left that required an audience? At the front of the hall stood a large screen and a projector, arranged by the local lawyer who managed Eleanor's estate. The Hayes siblings sat in the front row, visibly uncomfortable. Michael scrolled impatiently on his phone until Jessica nudged him sharply. David slouched, muttering under his breath about how ridiculous it was to turn a will into a spectacle. When the lights dimmed, a hush fell over the room. The screen flickered to life, and there she was, Eleanor Hayes, seated in her armchair, her shawl draped around her shoulders, her expression calm yet resolute. The room collectively gasped. It was as if she had returned to speak from beyond the grave. Jessica's hand flew to her mouth. Michael stiffened, his jaw tightening. David blinked, his face pale in the dim glow of the screen. The lawyer cleared his throat. Per Eleanor Hayes' request, you will now hear her final message. The crowd leaned forward, anticipation heavy in the air. The siblings exchanged uneasy glances. They had come expecting a will, but what they were about to receive was something far more unsettling. A truth broadcast not in whispers behind closed doors, but in full view of everyone they had ever hoped to impress. The church hall fell silent as Eleanor's image flickered across the screen. She sat in her familiar armchair, a soft lamp casting a golden glow on her face. Her posture was upright, her shawl draped neatly across her shoulders, as though she had taken great care in preparing for this moment. For a heartbeat, the crowd seemed to forget she was gone. It felt as though she were there with them, speaking directly to their hearts. "Good evening," Eleanor began, her voice calm but commanding. "If you are watching this, then I have left this world behind. But before I go quietly into memory, I have a few things to say." A murmur rippled through the audience. Michael shifted uncomfortably in his seat, Jessica clasped her hands tightly, and David's gaze dropped to the floor. Eleanor continued, her tone warm but edged with something sharper. "First, I want to thank the people of Willow Creek. You were my neighbors, my friends, my companions in times of both joy and sorrow. When my children grew too busy, when the phone stopped ringing, it was you who remembered me. You who brought me food when I was ill, who shoveled my walk in winter, who stopped by simply to ask, 'How are you today, Eleanor?' For those kindnesses, I am eternally grateful." The townspeople shifted in their seats, touched by her words. Mrs. Clark, sitting near the front, dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief. Then Eleanor's expression grew more solemn. "Now, to my children, Michael, Jessica, David. I raised you with everything I had, my love, my time, my sacrifices. I watched you grow into fine young adults, each with promise, each with potential. But somewhere along the way, you forgot not only where you came from, but who you are." Jessica flinched. Michael's lips pressed into a thin line. David clenched his fists. "I will not scold you here," Eleanor said, her eyes steady, "but I will speak the truth, for truth is the only inheritance worth leaving behind. You turned away from me when I needed you most. Birthdays passed in silence, holidays grew cold and empty, and yet I forgive you, not because you deserve it, but because I refuse to let bitterness be the last thing that defines me." The hall was thick with tension, every word landing like a stone in still water. "But forgiveness," Eleanor added, her voice steadying, "does not mean forgetting. In the years I spent alone, I learned that family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it is the people who choose to stand beside you, without obligation, without expectation. That, my children, is a lesson you have yet to learn." Gasps and whispers rippled through the crowd. The siblings sat rigid, their perfect facades beginning to crack under the weight of their mother's words. And as the video faded for a moment, leaving only the sound of the projector's hum, it was clear. Eleanor Hayes had not gathered them for a will. She had summoned them for a reckoning. The hall fell into a suffocating hush as Eleanor's image returned on the screen. Her blue eyes, still sharp and unwavering, seemed to pierce through the front row seats where Michael, Jessica, and David sat frozen. She took a slow, deliberate breath, as if savoring the moment before the truth tumbled out. "Michael," she began, her voice steady, "you built your empire on ambition, yes, but also on deception. For years, you have manipulated contracts, hidden debts, and used people's trust as stepping stones for your own gain. The company you flaunt so proudly is built on lies. I know this because I always watched, because I always cared." Michael's face paled. He opened his mouth, but no words came. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. A few murmured, glancing at each other in disbelief. The man they had admired as a self-made businessman was now laid bare, his credibility teetering on the edge of ruin. Eleanor's gaze shifted to Jessica. "Jessica, my beautiful daughter, your life has seemed flawless. You wore the mask so well. But masks have a way of slipping. You have hidden your desires, your choices, behind perfection. Your marriage, admired by many, has been tainted by betrayal. The man you met here in Willow Creek, yes, he exists. Your secret cannot protect you now, not from truth, not from me." Jessica gasped, pressing a hand to her mouth. Her husband's name echoed unspoken in the hall, but the tension alone made whispers crawl like fire through the crowd. A few neighbors exchanged glances, shock flickering in their eyes. Then Eleanor turned her attention to David. "And David, my once brightest boy, I loved you with everything I had, yet you squandered that love. You gambled, you lied, and you risked not only your future, but mine. Do you remember the night the house almost slipped from our hands? That debt, that reckless choice? You hid it from me, thinking I would never find out. I did. And yet, I still loved you." David's hands trembled, his face turning red as though the blood had suddenly drained from his heart. He glanced at his siblings, but they offered no comfort, only judgment reflected in their eyes. The townspeople were stunned. Eleanor's revelations pierced the air like knives. For decades, the Hayes family had been the picture of respectability. Now the illusion shattered before everyone's eyes. It was one thing to gossip behind closed doors, another to hear the matriarch herself confirm every sordid truth. Some neighbors whispered among themselves, their voices tinged with disbelief and awe. "I never would have believed it," one said quietly. "All those years and we had no idea." Eleanor leaned forward slightly, her hands clasped. "I share this not to humiliate you, my children, but to remind the world that deeds, good and bad, cannot remain hidden forever. The choices you made in secret have consequences, and today, those consequences stand in full view." The camera lingered on her calm face as the siblings sat frozen, their carefully curated lives exposed in a single, unflinching statement. The hall seemed to hold its breath, knowing that what had begun with truth was only the beginning of Eleanor Hayes' final reckoning. The hall had been silent for only a heartbeat before tension erupted like a storm. Michael's face had gone pale, but now his hands clenched into fists. "How dare she?" he spat, his voice echoing unnervingly against the high ceilings. "Who does she think she is, exposing all of this to the entire town?" Jessica's lips trembled as she stood, her polished composure cracking. "Michael, calm down!" "Don't make a scene," she whispered sharply, though the whispered tone barely concealed the fury in her eyes. But even as she spoke, her own voice betrayed her panic. The whispers from the crowd seemed to grow louder in her mind, each one an accusation, each glance a mirror reflecting her shame. David, meanwhile, could barely keep his balance in his chair. His fingers drummed nervously on the pew, and then, with a sudden surge of anger, he slammed his hand on the wooden bench. "She's gone too far this time. This is public humiliation," he barked, his face flushed and eyes darting from sibling to sibling. "You two think you're better than me? Look at yourselves. We've all made mistakes, but at least I've been honest with myself." Michael's voice cut over David's, sharp and commanding. "Honest? You call gambling away the family house honest? You've embarrassed us all. Jessica jumped in, her voice trembling with frustration and shame. And you think your little corporate empire is clean? Everyone knows the lies, Michael. We all have skeletons, but at least I didn't ruin what our mother worked for. The three of them turned on each other, their voices rising, echoing across the church hall. The townspeople leaned forward in their seats, some murmuring in shock, others wide-eyed with fascination. What they had expected to be a solemn, quiet inheritance reading had transformed into a live spectacle of raw emotion. You think you're better than me because you married into money? David shot back, his anger boiling over. And you, Jessica, with your affair, don't think this doesn't ruin you too. We're all standing in the same shame now. Michael stood abruptly, pacing in front of the pew. Enough. Eleanor left us nothing because we deserved nothing. She saw right through us, through our masks, our pretensions, our so-called lives, and now the town sees it too. Jessica's face twisted with fury, a mixture of guilt and resentment. And it's all her doing. Every word, every secret revealed. She planned this. She orchestrated our humiliation perfectly. David, breathing heavily, looked around the hall, suddenly aware of the dozens of eyes watching them. He realized, too late, that their family's private failings were no longer private. The crowd was silent, but their stares were sharp, judgmental, and unforgiving. As the siblings argued, Eleanor's voice from the video lingered in their minds, calm and unwavering. Every word had been measured, every revelation precise. The reckoning had begun, and now the siblings were devouring each other while the town watched, captivated by their downfall. For the Hayes children, pride had shattered, anger had flared, and beneath it all, the bitter sting of fear began to settle in. They had underestimated their mother and the power of truth. The church hall seemed to hold its breath as Eleanor's image reappeared on the screen, calm and poised as ever. The siblings, still seething from the exposés and their public humiliation, sat frozen in the front row. Michael's fists were clenched, Jessica's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and David's hands trembled in his lap. For a moment, the hall felt suspended in time, as though everyone, siblings and townspeople alike, was waiting for the next blow. Eleanor began, her voice steady, resonating with a clarity that made even the most skeptical lean forward. My children, you have seen the truth about yourselves. You have heard what I know. And now it is time for the final lesson. The inheritance, if that is what you seek, will not be found in a ledger or bank account. You will find it in the choices we make in life and the people we lift up, rather than those we allow to disappoint us. The townspeople exchanged puzzled glances. A few whispered in curiosity, not yet understanding the weight of what Eleanor was about to reveal. Michael's eyes narrowed, suspicion and dread twisting his features. What do you mean? He muttered under his breath. Eleanor continued, her tone deliberate, as though savoring the revelation. I have established a trust, substantial and enduring, worth millions, but it is not for you, my children. It is for the people of Willow Creek who showed me kindness when you could not. Scholarships for those striving to study. Housing assistance for the elderly who live alone. Medical funds for those who cannot afford care. Opportunities for those who, like me, have learned to endure life's hardships with grace and resilience. Gasps swept through the hall. Some neighbors erupted into applause, their hands clapping over mouths in awe. Mrs. Clark's eyes welled with tears, while the young couple from down the street exchanged astonished smiles. The room seemed to vibrate with excitement and disbelief, a shared recognition that Eleanor had orchestrated something extraordinary. The siblings, however, were stunned into a mixture of rage and disbelief. Michael slammed his hand against the pew. She can't do this. This money, this was supposed to be ours. Jessica's composure broke entirely. How could she? After everything, she leaves it to them, not us, not her own family? Her voice cracked, fury and heartbreak mingling in each syllable. David buried his face in his hands, muttering incoherently. This isn't fair. She promised us. But Eleanor's words cut through their protests, even from the screen. Fairness is not defined by inheritance or entitlement. True wealth is measured by love, by loyalty, by the hands we hold and the lives we touch. You, my children, failed to stand by me. But Willow Creek did not. And so, they will inherit my legacy." The hall erupted with applause once more, the townspeople rising to their feet in recognition and gratitude. The siblings remained seated, shells of their former pride, realizing that the world had shifted around them, and their mother had orchestrated it all with unerring precision. Eleanor's final act was not just financial, it was moral, and in that moment it became clear. The Hayes legacy had been rewritten, and the town itself had become her true family. The moment Eleanor's words sank in, the church hall seemed to erupt with life. What had begun as a somber gathering had transformed into an extraordinary display of communal emotion. Neighbors who had quietly observed Eleanor's final days now felt the surge of gratitude and admiration that had been building inside them for years, a recognition that she had trusted them with more than money. She had entrusted them with hope. Mrs. Clark, the elderly neighbor who had often brought pies and warm smiles, was the first to stand. Her voice quavered with emotion as she addressed the crowd. She saw what we did for her when no one else did. She believed in us, and now she's giving back. Not to her children, not to the wealthy, but to us, her friends, her family in spirit. A ripple of agreement swept through the room. Neighbors rose from their seats, some trembling with emotion, others clapping. Tears streamed freely. People who had been struggling silently for years now felt a sense of justice, a vindication that life's hardships had not gone unnoticed. Children peered up at their parents, absorbing the idea that a single act of kindness could echo far beyond one person's life. The siblings, however, remained at the front, a tableau of stunned disbelief. Michael's jaw tightened as he glared at the townspeople, as if willing them to feel guilty for Eleanor's choices. Jessica's hands shook, her carefully maintained facade crumbling entirely. David's face was pale, his anger intermingled with the hollow realization that he had been outmaneuvered by a mother he had underestimated. Whispers spread among the crowd, growing into cheers. People spoke of what Eleanor's trust could mean: scholarships for local students, funds to repair homes, support for those struggling with medical bills. Willow Creek had long been a town of modest means, its residents working tirelessly yet quietly, often unseen by the wider world. Now Eleanor had shone a spotlight on them, empowering them in ways that no one had anticipated. A young teacher, her hands still wet from wiping tears, spoke up. "She didn't just give us money, she gave us dignity. She reminded us that we matter." Applause erupted again, louder this time, echoing off the walls of the hall. The Hayes siblings felt the weight of their mother's judgment. They had expected inheritance and prestige. Instead, they were left exposed, humbled, and powerless. Their private failings were no longer just theirs. They had been witnessed, magnified, and morally condemned by the very community they had underestimated. The town's uprising was not angry. It was celebratory. It was a collective acknowledgement that goodness could be recognized, nurtured, and rewarded. For Eleanor's children, the moment was devastating. For the town, it was electrifying. In a single act, Eleanor had rewritten the balance of power in Willow Creek, leaving her children to grapple with shame while the town stood tall, united, and inspired. And in that hall, amid tears and applause, it became undeniable. Eleanor Hayes had transcended family and wealth. She had become the heartbeat of a community, and no one would forget her final lesson. The church hall was still buzzing from the revelations, a mixture of awe, relief, and exhilaration filling the air. The townspeople had absorbed Eleanor Hayes' final message, and now they were alive with purpose, a renewed sense of community and connection that none had expected. What had been an ordinary gathering had transformed into a celebration of Eleanor's life, her wisdom, and her unwavering moral clarity. At the front, the Hayes siblings sat frozen, a mixture of rage, disbelief, and helplessness etched into their faces. Michael's fists were clenched so tightly that his knuckles were white. Jessica's carefully arranged composure had collapsed entirely, leaving her shaking and near tears. David sat slumped, muttering to himself in a voice choked with anger and regret. Every word of Eleanor's final message reverberated in their minds. The truths exposed, the inheritance denied, the town elevated above them in both moral and social standing. Eleanor's image reappeared once more on the screen. Her voice was calm, warm, and unwavering, carrying a weight that seemed to hold the room in suspended attention. "I leave you, my children, with this final truth," she said, her eyes piercing even through the flickering screen. "Family isn't who you are born to. It's who stands by you, who lifts you up, who chooses to walk beside you through life's trials. You were my flesh and blood, but you are not my family in the ways that mattered most. The people who showed kindness, who honored trust and loyalty, are the ones who inherit my love and my legacy." A stunned silence followed. The siblings realized that their mother's words were not just a condemnation but a declaration. The world had been reordered, and their perceived privileges had been stripped away. Eleanor's wealth, her influence, and her moral authority had been redirected to those who deserved it, not by law, but by the force of her unwavering judgment. The crowd began to rise, slowly at first, then with increasing fervor. They cheered, they clapped, and some wept openly. Children hugged their parents, neighbors shook hands, and old friendships were strengthened in the shared recognition of Eleanor's gift. The town itself seemed to pulse with renewed energy, as though her final act had breathed life into every street and home. For Michael, Jessica, and David, there was no consolation. The community's applause was a reminder of their failures, their selfishness, and their inability to recognize what truly mattered. In one afternoon, everything they had expected to claim, the inheritance, the prestige, the admiration, was gone, replaced by public shame and moral reckoning. As the projector hummed its final note, Eleanor's face faded from the screen, leaving the siblings in stunned silence and the town in exhilarated unity. The matriarch had passed, but her presence lingered in every heart and mind, her principles etched into the very fabric of Willow Creek. Her legacy was no longer a private inheritance, it was a living testament to the power of kindness, courage, and moral clarity. And so, Eleanor Hayes' story concluded not in grief or loss, but in transformation. Her family humbled, her town empowered, and her life a reminder that the truest measure of legacy is not wealth, but the love and loyalty one leaves behind.